Emerging Threats Hub. The Iran War's Missing Strategy, Decapitation without Endgame.
What happens when you successfully decapitate a theocracy, but leave its fighting capacity entirely intact? The United States and Israel may have won the battle against Iran's nuclear program, but a growing number of analysts suggest they may be losing the war. This week, we're examining a conflict that defies the familiar scripts of modern warfare. There is no clear front line, no conventional army surrendering, and critically no visible endgame. I'm Sebastian, and this is Emerging Threats Hub. We're going to do something different this week. Instead of our usual survey of global flashpoints, we're going to focus deeply on one story, because this story contains within it almost every challenge facing the international system today. The death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has created something unprecedented, a power vacuum at the heart of one of the world's most consequential regional actors. But here's what's missing from most coverage: the strategic plan for what comes next. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll explore four major themes. First, the succession crisis in Tehran and why coercive regime change keeps failing. Second, Iran's asymmetric advantages, hypersonic missiles, drone warfare, and the Strait of Hormuz that make escalation favor the seemingly weaker party. Third, the European response, how the Iran conflict is accelerating a continental defense transformation that may reshape NATO itself. And finally, the missing question: what is the end game? What does stability actually look like when the immediate military objectives are achieved? Let's begin.
The succession crisis. The decapitation strategy.
In constructivist terms, a theocracy is not merely a government, it is a system of meaning. The supreme leader in Iran doesn't just execute policy. He embodies the revolutionary idea that gives the state its legitimacy. So when analysts at Foreign Affairs and Small Wars Journal describe what they call the new Khamenei problem, they're touching on something fundamental. You cannot remove the head of a theocracy and expect the body to simply continue functioning. The body itself was built around that head. The current crisis involves multiple competing centers of power. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has entrenched economic and military interests. The clerical establishment has its own succession preferences. And there are figures like Ayatollah Sistani, Iraq's most senior Shia cleric, who recently denounced the war against Iran, a statement that carries weight across the Shia world. But here's where we must challenge the realist paradigm that dominates Western policy thinking. Realist analysis would tell you that power vacuums naturally resolve themselves through competition. The strong survive, the weak are eliminated. It treats this as a mechanical process, almost like physics. But this is wrong. Power vacuums are socially constructed. They resolve themselves according to the ideas, identities, and institutions that existed before the crisis. And in Iran, those institutions, the IRGC, the Banyads, the religious foundations, are designed for resilience.
Why coercion failed.
A revealing piece in Small Wars Journal asks a devastating question: why did coercion fail in Iran? The authors argue that American policymakers fundamentally misread the Iranian political system. They treated it like a unitary state, a single entity with unified preferences, rather than what it actually is: a complex network of competing institutions held together by revolutionary ideology and shared resistance to external pressure. Think of it this way: if you're trying to coerce a corporation, you target the CEO. But if you're trying to coerce a religious movement, removing the leader doesn't weaken the movement. It can galvanize it. The ideology remains. The networks remain. And now you've created martyrdom. The constructivist insight here is crucial. States are not billiard balls that react predictably to force. They interpret that force through their own identities and histories. For Iran, the United States is not just an adversary. It's the great Satan, a civilizational opponent that has attempted to dominate Iranian politics since 1953. This isn't propaganda. This is lived historical memory, and it shapes how Iran responds to pressure.
Iran's asymmetric advantages. The escalation paradox.
Now I want to pivot to something that should concern everyone listening. Why does escalation favor Iran in this conflict? The conventional realist analysis would suggest that military superiority determines escalation dominance. The United States has more aircraft carriers, more advanced fighters, more nuclear weapons. Israel has superior intelligence and regional air superiority. But this analysis misses something fundamental. Escalation is not a contest of material capability. It's a contest of will, cost tolerance, and asymmetric leverage. Iran holds cards that the United States cannot easily counter.
The hypersonic threat.
Let's talk about the Fatah 2 hypersonic missile. This weapon travels at 15 times the speed of sound. Let me repeat that. 15 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, current interception technologies are effectively useless. The flight time from Iran to Israel becomes minutes, not hours, leaving decision-makers with almost no response window. Defense Feeds published a technical examination of this capability, and the implications are sobering. Hypersonic weapons don't just change the balance of material forces. When your adversary can strike before you can react, the traditional logic of mutual assured destruction begins to fray. But Iran's asymmetric advantage extends beyond missiles.
The drone revolution.
Army technology analyzed Iran's Shahed drone program, calling it Iran's single reliable weapon. What makes the Shahed system effective isn't its sophistication, it's its cost. These drones cost a fraction of American counter-drone systems. This creates what defense analysts call a cost asymmetry problem. Imagine trading $1 million interceptor missile for a $20,000 drone. Now imagine doing that hundreds of times. The economics of attrition favor the cheaper platform, not the more sophisticated one. Foreign Affairs noted something even more striking. The Pentagon has essentially copied Tehran's drone technology, but struggles to keep up. The innovation cycle in modern warfare has flipped. For decades, the United States developed technologies that adversaries tried to reverse engineer. Now, in drone warfare, the United States is the one catching up. The United States spent an estimated $3.4 trillion in military competition with China between 22 and 24. Meanwhile, Iran has developed a drone doctrine that imposes asymmetric costs on vastly superior adversaries.
The Hormuz factor.
And then there's geography. The Strait of Hormuz remains Iran's most powerful asymmetric lever. 20% of global oil consumption passes through this narrow waterway. Foreign Affairs published an analysis titled The Hormuz Minefield, examining Iran's advantage in this critical choke point. The piece argues that America's options are remarkably limited. Naval mines are cheap and difficult to clear. Speedboat attacks are difficult to attribute and nearly impossible to prevent entirely. The global economy runs on just-in-time logistics that cannot tolerate extended disruptions. Defense Priorities published a complementary analysis. Weakened by war, Iran hits back by strangling vital waterway. This is the escalation paradox. A materially weaker actor can impose asymmetric costs through geography, technology, and economic leverage. Material superiority does not automatically translate into escalation dominance.
The European Defense Awakening. Rearmament realities.
Now let's connect this conflict to the broader transformation occurring in Europe. SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, recently released data showing that European arms imports have tripled since 2000. Tripled. This is the largest peacetime rearmament in decades. But raw numbers don't tell the whole story. RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, published an analysis asking, who will pay the cost of freedom in Europe? The question is not just how much Europe spends, but how it spends it, and whether it can spend it together.
The Polish veto.
Here's where things get complicated and interesting. Poland's president recently vetoed a €40 billion EU defense funding plan. The concerns? Sovereignty. European defense integration, in the Polish view, risks undermining national control over critical defense decisions. This is not obstructionism. This is a legitimate tension between two valuable goals: the efficiency of collective action and the legitimacy of democratic sovereignty. The constructivist lens helps here. European defense integration is not a technical problem to be solved through institutional engineering. It's a question of identity. What kind of European security identity do member states want to construct? A pooled, integrated force that represents European power collectively? Or a network of national forces, coordinated but not merged? Both visions have merit. Both have costs. The Polish veto is not a failure. It's a necessary friction in the construction of a new European security architecture.
Nuclear questions.
Perhaps the most striking development is happening in the Nordic countries. Euractiv reports that Norway and Sweden, long champions of disarmament, are now debating nuclear weapons for the first time in decades. President Macron has offered what he calls forward deterrence, a distinctly European nuclear approach that would extend French and British nuclear umbrellas more explicitly to continental allies. What does it say about European security when the most pacifist nations on the continent are questioning disarmament? It says that the international environment has fundamentally shifted. The assumptions that guided European security since the end of the Cold War, that the United States would provide extended deterrence indefinitely, that Russia was integrating into Europe, that major land war in Europe was unthinkable, these assumptions have collapsed. A new European security identity is being constructed in real time, and it's being constructed under the pressure of events, not through deliberate design.
Technology and underlying systems. The autonomous battlefield.
I want to briefly connect these developments to a broader technological transformation. Foreign Affairs published two pieces that deserve attention: The Autonomous Battlefield and America's Endangered AI Dominance. The United States leads in artificial intelligence development, but leadership in development is not the same as dominance in application. Cybersecurity vulnerabilities threaten the infrastructure that advanced AI systems depend on. Meanwhile, in the Iran conflict, we're seeing what defense analysts call the combat power of simplicity. Small Wars Journal published an analysis arguing that old-school approaches can counter high-tech chaos. Mass, reliability, simplicity. These have operational value that exquisite technologies sometimes lack. RUC explored a related theme in Mass versus Exquisite Weaponry, challenging the false dichotomy between quantity and quality. The question is not whether to invest in sophisticated systems. The question is whether to build defense architectures that can tolerate attrition and remain effective under degraded conditions. Iran's approach, low-cost drones, hypersonic missiles that prioritize speed over guidance complexity, Asymmetric geographic leverage represents a different philosophy. Not inferior technology, but appropriate technology designed for specific strategic effects.
Under the radar.
And now, time to go under the radar. This week, I want to highlight a story that hasn't received the attention it deserves. Euractiv published an analysis titled, "Iran Offers China a Huge Espionage Opportunity." The piece examines how Beijing might exploit Iran's current vulnerability. A weakened Islamic Republic, desperate for support, could provide China with unprecedented access to regional intelligence, military infrastructure, and strategic positioning. Why does this matter? Because it connects the Iran conflict to the broader strategic competition between the United States and China. If Iran survives this crisis but emerges economically dependent and politically isolated, it may become effectively a Chinese client state. That would reshape power dynamics not just in the Middle East, but across the Indo-Pacific. The constructivist insight here is crucial. States don't balance against power alone. They balance against threats. And a Chinese-Iranian alignment, built on shared opposition to American hegemony, would represent a different kind of threat than Iranian unilateral action. This is what strategic thinking requires. Not just analyzing the immediate conflict, but tracing the secondary and tertiary consequences across the international system. Let me bring these threads together. We've examined the Iran succession crisis and why coercion keeps failing. Because the realist paradigm that treats states as unitary actors misses the social and institutional complexity that gives states resilience. We've explored Iran's asymmetric advantages, not military superiority, but escalation leverage through hypersonic weapons, cost-imposing drone warfare, and geographic control of critical waterways. We've seen how this conflict is driving a European defense transformation that may produce a more capable but also more fragmented European security identity. And we've considered how China might exploit Iranian vulnerability, a reminder that regional conflicts have global strategic implications.
The missing strategy.
Small Wars Journal published perhaps the most important piece in this collection. Its title, "The Strategy We Are Not Prosecuting." The critique is devastating. The United States targeted the headline, "Iran's Nuclear Program," but left the story untouched, Tehran's proxy network across the region. The analyst argues that decapitation without follow-through creates not stability, but chaos. What's the end game? Foreign Affairs asks this question directly. What is the end game for the US in Iran? And that brings me to my central argument today. Realist analysis tells us that military success determines outcomes, but the constructivist understanding reveals something different. Outcomes are determined by the ideas, institutions, and identities that survive the conflict. If the United States destroys Iran's nuclear program, but leaves a resentful, wounded state with intact asymmetric capabilities and a reinforced narrative of resistance, what has been achieved? If Europe rearms, but cannot integrate those forces politically, what kind of security has been constructed? If the international system fragments into competing civilizational blocks, Atlanticist versus Eurasian, what happens to the liberal order that has underpinned decades of relative stability?
A path forward.
So, what would a solution-oriented approach look like? First, acknowledge that military success is not synonymous with strategic success. Destroying capabilities is not the same as resolving conflicts. Second, engage with Iranian identity and interests, not because Iran is right, but because durable settlements require addressing the underlying drivers of conflict, not just the military manifestations. Third, recognize that European defense integration will proceed at different speeds with different levels of commitment. That's not failure. That's how political communities actually construct new capabilities. Fourth, think systemically. The Iran conflict doesn't exist in isolation. From the US-China competition, from European security debates, from technological transformation, every action has ripple effects across the international system. The path to stability is not through more weapons, more strikes, more decapitation attempts. It's through constructing new frameworks of meaning, new institutions of conflict management, new identities that make cooperation possible. International politics is not a timeless, mechanical struggle for power. It's a social system, constructed by human choices and human ideas. That means it can be reconstructed through different choices, different ideas, different frameworks. The question is whether we have the wisdom to choose stability over dominance, architecture over destruction, peace over endless war. That's the question I'll leave you with today. Thank you for joining me on Emerging Threats Hub. If you found this analysis valuable, I'd encourage you to subscribe and share it with colleagues who are thinking through these same questions. The more we understand these dynamics, the better positioned we are to advocate for solutions that work. Follow us on Blue Sky and Twitter for updates and analysis. Though after today's episode, I hope you'll agree that the most dangerous threats aren't always the ones making headlines. I'm Sebastian. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and I'll see you next time on Emerging Threats Hub.